They told me that the classics never got a style, but they do. They do. Somehow, baby, I never thought that we do too.
Get From the iMember Media Sonoran Desert Studios. Welcome to Follow Up. Back on May 13th of 2015, I began a public argument for re-envisioning our failed criminal justice system on a podcast called Dogma Debate with David Smalley. After a life of being dedicated to exposing the evils of our actions and promoting the good of solutions, I'm stuck, lost, and must go on another adventure of growth. I long planned to go back to that May 13th episode on Dogma Debate and start picking myself apart, listening to your feedback. We've had some trouble digging up that old episode, so I decided to take the advice of Los Angeles director, photographer, and creative Adrian Rojas Elliott, who kept telling me to get to work on these. So I'm going to put up what I can without worrying that it is all in chronological order. These do take a long time to make, and a reminder to everyone, I am a full-time student doing my dissertation study, a full-time dad, a full-time husband, and still recovering from a motorcycle crash. Yeah, a crash from over a year ago, back in May of 2017. I was riding in Los Angeles after filming with TYT. The Young Turks. There's a lot to discuss about them one of these days, as I believe that no two people have lied more right to my face than Cenk Uygur and Anna Kasparian. Most people at least have some shame and try to hide their lies. But as we were saying, so I'm riding back home on a beautiful sunny day in the far right slow lane of a 6-lane road, 3 on each side, when some lady from oncoming traffic decides to just turn left into the path in front of me. there was an entrance to a hardware store or something there. I had no idea if somebody were behind me or to my left, so I just held onto the brakes as much as possible. Went flying all Matrix style over the car as my bike smashed into the side. It was like one of those slow motion times. I was thinking to myself as I was flipping through the air, remember to tuck your head, bring your arms in, and roll as soon as you hit the ground. And you don't know if somebody's behind you, so you better jump up and get the hell out of the road. I tucked, I rolled, I got back up and looked, but fortunately, no one was behind me. My helmet was destroyed, and I thought my bike was too, but the insurance company ended up fixing it. So far, I ended up with a broken ankle, a sprained neck, a concussion, a torn LCL, a torn ACL, a torn meniscus, and the LCL meniscus just got fixed. So now that I'm on my crutches again, I'm pretty sure that something is wrong with my right shoulder, as my only good shoulder. So that is the condition I have been in physically over the last year while still doing all of this. I also just wrote a philosophical book, Crimes and Punishments in the 21st Century, which lays out the complete philosophy of a scientific and moral approach to crime, helped build and launch iMember Media website publications. And please do check out that website, imembermedia.com, just as it sounds. There's a bit of play on words intertwining the nostalgia that the lowercase I of the Apple era created, the future of digital media, and then that lowercase I and the two double M's are easily reflected in our Sonoran Desert themed logos, as the saguaro cactus being the I and the two M's being mountains. So we moved to Phoenix, unable to afford LA or fit in, and it is First date: Prince George's County Police Department Narcotics Detective Jakai Colson, or beloved school cafeteria nutritionist Philando Castile. We must face reality about what policing, in general, is the philosophy that people make rational decisions to commit a crime and that we can punish them enough to deter them. Both concepts have been wholly disproven for decades. A career of work has shown 4 correlates to violent crime, which are strong enough to understand as causations. Not a single police department in the United States is fighting the 4 known causes of violent crime. They are environmental poisoning. In the current state and prioritized by contribution to violence, poisoning is highlighted by lead, but includes mercury, arsenic, asbestos, cadmium, dioxins, PCBs, too little or too much fluoride, and harmful pesticides. Economic inequality. It is not poverty. Poverty leans towards a peaceful influence, if any. Inequality is when it is in your face or at your expense, and the greater the disparity, the more significant the impact on violence causation. Local instability. These are the things which contribute to the stress of desperation and can come from a myriad of sources, but it is often noted to us by its other symptoms, such as fatherless homes, lack of resources, and socioeconomic opportunity disparities. The police. Now, maybe during the LA riots, where more than 50 deaths were riot related, 10 deaths resulted from state sanctioned violence, we see an indication that when pressed, the system intensifies in violence. In all of this, we see much discussion around the topic of race, while much of the discussion around police reform gets focused on dramatic examples of disproportionate representation in the Black community. One thing I've tried to make clear is that the fundamental structure of American policing is one that must continue to grow and expand its pool of victims. White America is not safe from this tyranny. I remember when 19-year-old Zachary Hammond, out on a date, was killed in our dangerous drug war. I remember barely any media attention at the typical white, all-American boy being executed broad daylight, on camera. The system wants you to keep thinking that it protects you. It only harms others in that effort. That is a lie. The staff of The Guardian published an article after the officer who killed Zachary was fired. That September 4th, 2015 article is titled, "Police Officer Who Killed Zachary Hammond Fired a Year After Shooting."
He tried to hit me. I'm going to go call my PBA rep.
from the iMember Media Sonoranda Desert Studios. Welcome to Follow Up. Back on May 13th of 2015, I began a public argument for re-envisioning our failed criminal justice system on a podcast called Dogma Debate with David Smalley. After a life of being dedicated to exposing the evils of our actions and promoting the good of solutions, I'm stuck, lost, and must go on another adventure of growth. I long planned to go back to that May 13th episode on Dogma Debate and start picking myself apart, listening to your feedback. We've had some trouble digging up that old episode, so I decided to take the advice of Los Angeles director, photographer, and creative Adrian Rojas Elliott, who kept telling me to get to work on these. So I'm going to put up what I can without worrying that it is all in chronological order. These do take a long time to make, and a reminder to everyone, I am a full-time student doing my dissertation study, a full-time dad, a full-time husband, and still recovering from a motorcycle crash. Yeah, a crash from over a year ago, back in May of 2017. I was riding in Los Angeles after filming with TYT. The Young Turks. There's a lot to discuss about them one of these days, as I believe that no two people have lied more right to my face than Cenk Uygur and Anna Kasparian. Most people at least have some shame and try to hide their lies. But as we were saying, so I'm riding back home on a beautiful sunny day in the far right slow lane of a 6-lane road, 3 on each side, when some lady from oncoming traffic decides to just turn left into the path in front of me. There was an entrance to a hardware store or something there. I had no idea if somebody were behind me or to my left, so I just held onto the brakes as much as possible. I went flying all Matrix style over the car as my bike smashed into the side. It was like one of those slow motion times. I was thinking to myself as I was flipping through the air, remember to tuck your head, bring your arms in and roll as soon as you hit the ground. And you don't know if somebody's behind you, so you better jump up and get the hell out of the road. I tucked, I rolled, I got back up and looked, but fortunately no one was behind me. My helmet was destroyed, and I thought my bike was too, but the insurance company ended up fixing it. So far, I ended up with a broken ankle, a sprained neck, a concussion, a torn LCL, a torn ACL, a torn meniscus, and the LCL meniscus just got fixed. So now that I'm on my crutches again, I'm pretty sure that something is wrong with my right shoulder. It's my only good shoulder. So that is the condition I have been in physically over the last year while still doing all of this. I also just wrote a philosophical book, Crimes and Punishments in the 21st Century, which lays out the complete philosophy of a scientific and moral approach to crime, helped build and launch iMember Media website publications, and please do check out that website, imembermedia.com, just as it sounds. There's a bit of play on words intertwining the nostalgia that the lowercase I of the Apple era created in the future of digital media, and then that lowercase I and the 2 double M's are easily reflected in our Sonoran Desert themed logos, as the saguaro cactus being the I and the 2 M's being mountains. So we moved to Phoenix, unable to afford LA or fit in, and it has apparently won a server quite a bit. I really like Phoenix, but I almost don't want to tell anyone, so you all just stay where you are, leave us here alone. Selfish, I suppose. I also produced over 20 podcasts and videos, appeared on others' podcasts, radio programs, television shows, and continually doing the work behind the scenes with activists while fielding many email and messages as possible. I cannot do anymore, and it's quite frustrating when seemingly half the communication I get is about how I can do more. But that's a different rant for a different day. Let's get on with the topic of this episode of Follow Up. This issue is brand spanking new, but related to that same line of thought. I get a lot of feedback from those of you out there that ask why I do not go on specific shows, or why I do not write more articles in newspapers or magazines, of why I am not reaching out to people. But everyone needs to know that I do, and I have been. This is not what media is about. Even your favorite people and shows, which I will get into more on this podcast in the future, not this episode, but this podcast, I was hoping to bring you along on a piece of this journey with me in near real time and see what it's like. I mean, let's see what is down the path of writing an op-ed for publication. At the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement, not the organization, and back when police reform was the narrative of the day, the newspaper The Guardian solicited me to write op-eds and developed a connection with me. I got caught up in other projects, but did write 2 articles for them, both of which I thought the editors butchered from what I originally wrote, which is something else I will discuss in this podcast series sometimes later. But the 2 articles that I wrote published for The Guardian were The Second Amendment is a Recipe for Police Killings, and I Was a Cop, but I Still Don't Know How to Survive a Police Stop. And I was published once in the Baltimore Sun with the article, Baltimore Police Department's New Use of Force Policy is Actually Old. I have submitted a couple more articles of both papers, but was never published again. With police reform scratching the surface of public discussion again, I wrote an article about how the structure of American police is impossible to reform and what the science tells us are the things that cause violence. That seems essential to know, right? So first I submitted the article to The Guardian, as they have been the most responsive and friendly one. They did respond quickly, again, with a no thanks. I then tried the Baltimore Sun, and the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times, Reason, Police One, Breitbart, InfoWars, Wired Magazine, USA Today, and not until I remember Times did it see the light of day. We had to do it ourselves. And maybe I'm just a shitty writer. I do not claim to stand out in that manner. Instead, in the experiences and research that I'm doing. But the bubbles of media and the coasts are formidable, and I have not figured out how to break through. After a bit about that Crimes and Punishment book, I'll get into reading that op-ed that I submitted. Like most cops, the emotions felt when pinning the badge on my uniform for the first time was a source of immense pride, but also a shocking reality to the complication of performing a duty under the weight of such power and responsibility. The callousness of veterans cops and the braggadocious masculinity of the streets are immature expressions of the generations of trauma enacted on our brothers and sisters from a system oppressing us all. My internal fights with policing, whistleblowing, scholarly endeavors, reform efforts, and politics have failed in exhausting fashion.
And what I'm trying to say is that we are looking at people who are doing nothing new, and if we focus on the actions, then we can fix the things for next time. Because when you focus on people, we end up thinking we can chop the head off, they put a new person in, and something will change. But if we don't focus on the methodologies and the institutions, then we will be totally missing
somebody, put them in a prison cell, do the paperwork, go back out, and do it again. So what we really need is to change the incentives and disincentives so that no matter what the role, we're still going towards that objective that actually serves you.
More occupation, more vehicles, if your answer continues to be violent, because we have to understand that everything about policing is inherently violent. I have come in there with authority and told you what you will do.
I believe one of the reasons behind my struggles is that I had not laid out a consistent and intertwined philosophy of what in the hell I was trying to say. For the philosophical foundations of crime and punishment to be ushered into the 21st century, a reimagination of our institutions is necessary. Building off the famous works of Cesar Beccaria, I construct those pathways to the Enlightenment period of justice. Free will, sanctuary cities, gun control, eyewitness testimony, incarceration, and more must all work together for a prosperous society. Learning these lessons has been a brutal journey for me, and it is unlikely to be an easy one for you, but it is one that we owe to the future, to make a safer world for our children to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Crimes and Punishments in the 21st Century by yours truly, Michael Wood, is most conveniently ordered from the evil empire Amazon, because we are in that 21st century after all. For the enhanced and expanded audiobook, check out Audible. In the meantime, the philosophical half of Crime and Punishments, all 40-some chapters and then some, is being presented as a free podcast from iMember Media at imembermedia.com and will be available on all major platforms and direct from the publisher. Pause the video or see the links in the notes and prepare for the challenge and adventure of self-critical thought. The broken record of policing. Another report of police brutality draws attention and briefly skips the tune. Ever since we began spinning the record of American policing, the same song has been playing. The beat is repetitive with an unrelenting tempo. The lyrics change with each skip, but you can barely notice a change. The melody plays on for all but the elite. The rhythm is so familiar that it provides comfort and blends into the background. Only the bumping of the record player by the media and culture briefly draws our attention to hear the verses about Newark cab driver John Smith, Rodney King, 19-year-old Zachary Hammond out on a first date, Prince George's County Police Department narcotics detective Jakai Colson, or beloved school cafeteria nutritionist Philando Castile. Essentially, policing is about control, and ultimately is the use of state violence to order compliance to the rulers or face sanctioned execution. The history of American policing was built off three pillars that continue to define the fundamental functioning of policing in the United States. Pillar number 1, the creation and maintenance of oppressed classes, from which resources are extracted to institute the oppression. As the classes of oppression grew and the people integrated the divisions into their personal identities, the cycles became more natural and more comfortable to everyone. In exchange for a little bit more money and a set of rules more like those which applied to the elite, the oppressed donned uniforms and executed the oppression of the other oppressed classes. Pillar number 2, the valuing of superior class property over the lives of oppressed classes. The elite pay for the police and politicians to protect their property. The rest of us can police our own property if we are the fortunate few that have some. This truth is reflected in the laws that govern us in nearly every police mission statement. The police form lines of protections around pipelines, not us. Pillar number 3, the continued genocide of the indigenous nations of North America. Genocide does not mean just physical death, but also the end of a culture and civilization. Though there is a general reluctance for us to acknowledge the truth of past and current destruction of the native nations, the case is undeniable. The Dakota Access Pipeline protesting of 2015 to 2016 in Standing Rock, North Dakota, put all three of these pillars on prominent display. To even begin effective reform efforts, we must face the truth about this system and divert our attention from blaming individuals. It is not about rotten apples. It is about a rotten barrel, and that barrel is constructed with planks of oppression, devaluing of human life, and genocide. The planks of the policing barrel have been seasoned throughout time with slavery, treaty violations, crime bills, mass incarceration, environmental poisoning, Jim Crow, regressive taxation, and more. This barrel cannot exist where there is a claim of serious attempts at police reform. Beyond facing the truth about American policing, we must face reality about what causes violence. Policing, in general, is the philosophy that people make rational decisions to commit a crime and that we can punish them enough to deter them. Both concepts have been wholly disproven for decades. A career of work has shown 4 correlates to violent crime, which are strong enough to understand its causations. Not a single police department in the United States is fighting the 4 known causes of violent crime. They are environmental poisoning. In the current state and prioritized by contribution to violence, poisoning is highlighted by lead, but includes mercury, arsenic, asbestos, cadmium, dioxins, PCBs, too little or too much fluoride, and harmful pesticides. economic inequality. It is not poverty. Poverty leans towards a peaceful influence, if any. Inequality is when it is in your face or at your expense, and the greater the disparity, the more significant the impact on violence causation. Local instability. These are the things which contribute to the stress of desperation and can come from a myriad of sources, but it is often noted to us by its other symptoms, such as fatherless homes, lack of resources, and socioeconomic opportunity disparities. The police. It sounds counterintuitive, but it is rather apparent once understanding the foundation of what policing is versus what we imagine it to be. Policing is the use of violence to achieve compliance with the authorities. No wonder 1 in 17 homicide victims are killed by police. This is a terrible reality to learn about, especially when we contemplate our own complicity in the constructs which have gotten us here. There is a moral imperative to face these issues once understood, and that can make us want to close our eyes and not accept responsibility. Fear has been used to get us to agree with such a system, and it is fear that keeps us from working together to stop what is becoming a self-inflicted wound. We are more comfortable in familiar violence than in unfamiliar freedom, and even though this record is skipping, it is a tune that has been playing for so long that we dance along to our own oppression, comfortable and familiar. I don't know, but it sounds like a decent article to me. Let's take a look. Let's take this opportunity to get more into some of the details of the article. Let's follow up. The best I can do for most of these is rely on some unreliable media sources, but I looked around and found a few articles that can provide some further understanding. Reading from an article by Tabitha Wang at the University of Washington, Seattle, let's talk about Newark cab driver John Smith.
The worst race riots since those 2 years ago in the Watts section of Los Angeles rocked New Jersey's largest city, Newark, for 5 consecutive days and nights. At least 24 persons are killed, more than 1,800 wounded, some 1,400 arrested. Despite patrolling by city and state police, millions of dollars in property damage is done. Looters wreck and clean out scores of shops in the Negro Ghetto District. The fury of the mob makes any official-looking vehicle a target. 2 days after its beginning, police are augmented by National Guardsmen. Snipers make the streets a battlefield. Governor Hughes terms the rioting open rebellion, just like wartime. Sniper fire from open windows kills 2 policemen, a fire captain shot in the back while answering a false alarm, and several bystanders. Scores of police, troopers, guardsmen, and civilians are wounded.
The Newark, New Jersey riot took place from July 12 through July 17, 1967, and was sparked by a display of police brutality. John Smith, an African-American cab driver for the Safety Cab Company, was arrested on Wednesday, July 12, when he drove his taxi around a police car and double-parked on 15th Avenue. According to a police report released to the press, Smith was charged with tailgating, driving in the wrong direction on a one-way street, using offensive language, and physical assault. A witness who had seen Smith's arrest called members of the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, the United Freedom Party, and the Newark Community Union Project, whose leaders were given permission to see Smith in his 4th Precinct holding cell. After noticing his injuries, they demanded that he be transported to a hospital. Their demands were granted, and Smith was moved to Beth Israel Hospital in Newark. Around 8 p.m., black cab drivers began to circulate the report of Smith's arrest on the radio. Word spread down 17th Avenue, west of the precinct police station where Smith had been held. Residents in the predominantly black city had a long history of similar events with the Newark police. Many of them angrily gathered on the streets facing the 4th precinct. At 11 p.m., one of the civil rights leaders informed the police that a peaceful protest would be organized across the street from the precinct. A police officer handed the leader a bullhorn to address the crowd. Bob Kervin, a member of CORE, was joined by Timothy Still, the president of an anti-poverty program, and Oliver Lofton, who was the administrator of the Newark Legal Services Project. Although the three speakers urged a nonviolent protest march, an unidentified local resident took the bullhorn and urged violence. Some men from the neighborhood began throwing bricks and bottles at the precinct windows. Shortly after midnight, 2 Molotov cocktails were thrown at the precinct. Then a group of 25 people on 17th Avenue began to loot stores. The looting drew larger crowds, and Newark was engulfed in a riot. Despite the violence on Thursday morning, Newark Mayor Hugh Addazionale announced that Wednesday night's activities were isolated incidents and were not of riot proportions. At 6 p.m. Thursday night, a large group of young kids gathered on the street where traffic had been blocked. Word spread along 17th Avenue that people would again demonstrate against the precinct. Human Rights Commissioner Director James Threat arrived and told the crowds to disperse. They refused, and rioting commenced for a second night. After midnight on Thursday, looting spread throughout the major commercial district in Newark. Groups of young adults smashed windows, chanting Black Power. At the same time the looting spread, the police were given clearance to use firearms to defend themselves. At 2:20 a.m., Mayor Addazionale asked Governor Richard J. Hughes to send in the National Guard to help restore order.
Take the lead here. On the second floor!
At around 4 a.m., a looter was shot while trying to flee from 2 police officers. By early Friday morning, 5 people had been killed, 425 people were jailed, hundreds were wounded. More than 3,000 National Guardsmen, 500 state troopers arrived by mid-afternoon, formed convoys, and dispersed throughout the city. Despite the presence of National Guardsmen and state troopers, rioting continued for 3 more days. As the riot approached its final hours, 26 people, mostly African Americans, were killed. Another 750 were injured, and over 1,000 were jailed. Property damage exceeded $10 million. The riot, the worst civil disorder in New Jersey history, ended on July 17, 1967.
Policeman, a fire captain shot in the back while answering a false alarm, and several bystanders. Scores of police, troopers, guardsmen, and civilians are wounded. Officials said the snipers, some believed not to be Newark residents, used guns stolen from a local rifle factory. Even machine guns were used. Because of widespread looting, 8 emergency food centers are set up to supply milk, bread, and cereal to besieged and terrorized residents. Looters arrested by National Guardsmen are dealt with swiftly. A 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew is clamped on fully 1/3 of Newark. While Newark struggles to restore peace and order, the racial bitterness spreads to 4 nearby suburban towns, where a policeman is beaten to death, guns are stolen, looting and violence are reported. New Jersey, a state under siege.
Now, I'm not going to overanalyze these articles. My main point is to look at the stories of those involved, so they are more than mere names and helped add some context. A few things to point out, though. We see the similar patterns of minor offenses, which are likely untrue, but at the very least nitpicky. It also shows how the police need to be one with the community, not something separated from it. The information travels much faster by word of mouth than any technology that we have imagined. And I bring you back to this line. At 4 a.m., a looter was shot while trying to flee from 2 police officers. Police protect property, not people. And that property is worth more than the lives of the oppressed classes. And maybe riots in general put on display the priority of policing to protect property, not people. Just remember that I am talking about the system of policing, not individual police officers, who are almost nearly always trying to do good, unaware of the system's outcomes. Speaking of riots, I'm actually old enough to remember hearing and seeing a good bit on television about the LA riots and the beating of Rodney King.
Ended early Sunday morning with the motorist, a black male, being brutally beaten and kicked by Los Angeles police officers. A beating that continued even as the man appeared to offer no resistance.
All of a sudden, police brutality had a human face, and it was being battered by Los Angeles cops on a neighborhood street in the San Fernando Valley. The face belonged to Rodney King, a 25-year-old high school dropout with a criminal record. He had been convicted of second-degree robbery, and he was out on parole.
The motorist was apparently shot by a taser gun, which is used to electrically shock a suspect into submission. But police also stomped on the man's head and repeatedly kicked him before both his wrists and ankles.
And now we read from an NPR report titled, "When LA Erupted in Anger, a look back at the Rodney King riots," by Anjali Sastry and Karen Grigsby Bates. 25 years ago this week, 4 Los Angeles policemen, 3 of them white, were acquitted of the savage beating of Rodney King, an African-American man. Caught on camera by a bystander, graphic video of the attack was broadcast into homes across the nation and worldwide. Fury over the acquittal, stoked by years of racial and economic inequality in the city, spilled over into the streets, resulting in 5 days of rioting in Los Angeles. It ignited a national conversation about racial and economic disparity and police use of force that continues today. When the verdict came out, it was a stunner for people coast to coast. My jaw dropped, says Jody David Armour, a criminal justice and law professor at the University of Southern California. There was ocular proof of what happened. It seemed compelling, he says of the videotape. And yet, we saw a verdict that told us we couldn't trust our lying eye, that what we thought was open and shut was really a reasonable expression of police control towards a black motorist. A year earlier, in March 1991, King, who was on parole for robbery, had led police on a high-speed chase through Los Angeles. Later, he was charged with driving under the influence. When police finally stopped him, King was ordered out of the car. Los Angeles Police Department officers then kicked him repeatedly and beat him with batons for a reported 15 minutes. The video showed that more than a dozen cops stood by, watching and commenting on the beating. King's injuries resulted in skull fractures, broken bones and teeth, and permanent brain damage. Ultimately, 4 officers were charged with excessive use of force. A year later, on April 29, 1992, a jury consisting of 12 residents from the distant suburbs of Ventura County, 9 white, 1 Latino, 1 biracial, 1 Asian, found the 4 officers not guilty. The acquittals were announced around 3 p.m. Less than 3 hours later, the unrest began. Residents set fires, looted and destroyed liquor stores, grocery stores, retail shops, fast food restaurants. Light-skinned motorists, both white and Latino, were targeted. Some were pulled out of their cars and beaten. The reaction to the acquittal in South Central Los Angeles, now known just as South Los Angeles, was particularly violent. At the time, more than half of the population there was black. Tension had already been mounting in the neighborhood in the years leading up to the riots. The unemployment rate was about 50%, a drug epidemic was ravaging the area, and gang activity and violent crime were high. Another contributing factor, the same month as Rodney King's beating, a Korean store owner in South Los Angeles shot and killed a 15-year-old African-American girl named Latasha Harlan, who was accused of trying to steal orange juice. It was later discovered Harlan's was clutching money to pay for the juice when she was killed. The store owner received probation and a $500 fine. The incident heightened tensions between Koreans and African Americans and intensified the black community's frustration with the criminal justice system. At the same time, the community's anger was also deepening against Los Angeles police. African Americans said they did not feel protected during times of need, but instead reported being harassed without cause. The LAPD at the time was almost an occupying force, particularly biased against people of color, says lawyer and civil rights activist Connie Rice. What we had was aggressive paramilitary policing, a culture that was mean and cruel, racist and abusive of force in communities of color, particularly poor communities of color, Rice says in an interview with NPR's Griggs Bates. It was an open campaign to suppress and contain the black community, she says. LAPD didn't even feel it was necessary to distinguish between pruning out a suspected criminal where they had probable cause to stop and just stopping African-American judges and senators and prominent athletes and celebrities simply because they were driving nice cars. The riots first began at an intersection in South Los Angeles, Florence and Normandy. According to news reports and first-hand accounts in the last 25 years, a white truck driver named Reginald Denny, who was beaten viciously by gang members who were rioting and had pulled Denny out of his truck at about 6:45 p.m. Barnett, her boyfriend, and the two strangers shoved Denny back into his truck and drove him to the hospital, which saved his life.
Reginald Denny was the truck driver. We watched him by the millions. Here is the tape of what happened there. Now, you're going to see people go up to the cab of this truck, I think, and pull him out. Let's see how the tape goes.
This is where it all started, and you heard Mark Ridley Thomas suggest that if the LAPD had come in and dealt with this in a big hurry, maybe all of this would have been avoided. And of course, the other side to that is that they were there, they knew they were outnumbered, they had to pull back for their own safety and by policy, and that's what happened. So you've got two sides to what we're seeing here. This is the beginning of it. There's the body.
There is Reginald Denny. He is the man who was pulled out of his truck, kicked and beaten terribly until he was...
We have Bobby Green, Jr., who I'm told is one of the men who came to the aid of this truck driver and got him out of there and got him to the hospital. Mr. Green, can you hear us?
Yes.
Were you one of the people that beat him up?
No.
All right, so that theory is out the window. Tell us what happened and how you helped this man.
Well, I was sitting home watching TV, and I seen this guy getting all beat up, so I'm a truck driver from Norman Trucking, so I just got out the car, got in my car and went over there and, helped him.
Did you have help?
Oh, yes, there was a woman right there, was on the door, hanging on the door, and he was driving, so he was driving real slow, so I told him to move to the side to have a seat so I could take him to the hospital.
Mm-hmm. But did you pick him up off the street all by yourself and get him in your truck?
No, he was already into the truck. He was already into the truck already, and he was driving it himself, but he was going real slow.
Oh, he did get back into the truck himself?
Yes.
He got back into that big, what is it, 14-wheeler we're looking at now?
Yes.
Beat up as he was, he managed to climb up into the truck, huh?
Yes.
Now, you're talking about the truck with the red cab and the two trailers?
Yes.
I'll be darned. I hadn't heard that before.
No. So he got back into that cab, and you found him trying to drive away from the scene when you got there, huh?
Right.
What kind of shape was he in, Mr. Green?
Oh, he was really, really, really bad. Bad shape.
Can you describe his injuries to us as best you can?
He had big holes under his eyes. His head was busted, everything. He seemed like he was ready to go unconscious.
So did you pushed him over and you drove him in?
Yes.
Was he conscious when you got to the hospital?
Not really. As soon as we got to the hospital, he went to a seizure.
A seizure?
Yes.
Did he say anything to you on the way to the hospital?
Yes.
What?
He said, "Thank you, sir, for helping me out."
How old a man was he, Mr. Green? Would you guess?
He probably was in his 35s, probably.
Yeah. Did you ever figure out why he got beat up like that?
He was white.
That was all, huh?
Yes.
Just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yes.
There were 4 cops in each car that passed by, Barnett told NPR in 1992. They saw us. They looked right through us. When 911 calls about the violence started coming in, police were not deployed immediately. Though LAPD Chief Daryl Gates announced early in the afternoon of April 29 that his officers had the situation under control, it would later be reported that the city was not adequately prepared for the riots. In fact, there was no anticipation of or official plan at the department for major social unrest on this scale. One of the most astounding things about the 1992 Los Angeles riots was the response of the LAPD, which is to say no response at all, says author Joan Dominack, who has studied and written about the riots in an interview with Grigsby Gates. That night, Gates went to speak at a fundraiser in West Los Angeles and reportedly ordered cops to retreat. Police did not respond to incidents of looting and violence around the city until almost 3 hours after the original rioting broke out. The rest of the night, the scene at Florence and Normandy repeated itself with rioters across the city. Just before 9 p.m. that night, Mayor Tom Bradley called for a state of emergency, and California Governor Pete Wilson ordered 2,000 National Guard troops to report to the city. On May 1, the third day of the riots, Rodney King himself attempted to publicly appeal to Los Angeles residents to stop fighting. He stood outside a Beverly Hills courthouse with his lawyer and asked people, "I just want to say, can we all get along? Can we get along?" During the 5 days of unrest, there were more than 50 riot-related deaths, including 10 people who were shot and killed by LAPD officers and National Guardsmen. More than 2,000 people were injured, and nearly 6,000 alleged looters and arsonists were arrested. Of those arrested during the riots, 36% were African Americans, 51% were Latinos, according to the RAND Corporation. The riots also disrupted daily life. A city curfew from sunset to sunrise was announced. Mail delivery stopped, and most residents couldn't go to work and school. More than 1,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed, and approximately 2,000 Korean-run businesses were also damaged or destroyed. In all, approximately $1 billion worth of property was destroyed. The city curfew was ultimately lifted on the morning of May 4th. Most schools, banks, and businesses were allowed to reopen. Slowly, residents returned to their everyday routines, but the Rodney King beating and the Los Angeles riots exploded out of the social issues that still have not been resolved. That shocking, grainy video of his beating would be just the first of a long line of police brutality videos to go viral. That and issues such as racial profiling are as evident now in places such as Baltimore, Ferguson, and other inner cities as they were in 1992 Los Angeles, says Armour, the USC professor and author of a book about what he calls the 1992 uprising. Ain't nothing changed but the year it is, he says. After the civil trial, Rodney King was awarded a settlement. He bought a modest house for his mother and one for himself in the LA suburb of Rialto, and occasionally spoke with at-risk kids at the request of local police. King, the son of an alcoholic father, continued to struggle with his own alcohol use after his beating. He told NPR in April 2012 that his sobriety was a work in progress. He was engaged to be married when he died that June. A skilled swimmer and surfer, King was found unconscious at the bottom of his swimming pool. His autopsy reported drugs and alcohol were in his system at the time of his death. He was 47. In 1993, Stacy Kuhn and Lawrence Powell, 2 of the 4 officers in the King case, were found guilty of violating King's civil rights. They both served 30 months in prison and did not return to the police force. They no longer live in California. 2 other officers, Timothy Wind and Theodore Bresnio, were both fired by LAPD and also no longer live in California. Tom Bradley, the first African-American mayor of Los Angeles, died in 1998 at age 80. He served 20 years as the city's leader. After 14 years as chief of LA Police, Daryl Gates was forced to resign in June of 1992. He died in 2010 at the age of 83. After extensive surgery and therapy, Reginald Denny, whose skull was fractured on April 29, a rioter threw a brick at his head, among other injuries, regained his ability to walk and talk. He now lives in Arizona.
From midnight to about 3 o'clock, we were getting about a little over 3 new fires a minute were coming in that we were having to cover, and in cases before we had resources, we were having to queue up on those fires.
Police cars streak through the intersection, but don't stop. It's the last time a police presence is seen on the videotape. The absence of the police in this, the early stages of the riot, and their slowness to respond afterwards, have provoked sharp criticism of the city's law enforcement.
Had the police department acted quickly, there would have been far less burning, looting, if the police had been quick to respond.
With the police absent from the intersection of Normandy and Florence Wednesday, the crowd starts dragging whites and Mexican Americans from their vehicles and beating them. Then, the scene that came to symbolize the brutality of the riot. Reginald Denny is pulled from his truck and nearly killed. Denny appears to beg for assistance. Other blacks later help him escape. Looters begin stripping stores. The riot is starting to spread. Night begins to fall, and the intersection is burning. Another man who was beaten staggers up as a black preacher seems to pray over him. Would a fast and firm police response have kept the violence that began here from escalating? The Los Angeles Police Commission is now investigating. Jack Smith, ABC News.
What happened to me was really quite fascinating in that I just pulled up, and normally when we go into this neighborhood, and we go into it quite frequently, they like us to be there because we can tell their side of the story. I was not there for 10 seconds before a young man came out with a dolly cart and slammed it in the front end of the news vehicle. Within a split second of that, 25 or 30 other things hit the side of the vehicle, did massive damage to the vehicle, and had I stayed around another 10 seconds, I think I would have been killed.
Were you by yourself in that?
By myself. I frequently go into that neighborhood. I mean, it's not that bad a place as it's made to be, but those people were intent on murder.
Tom, you said you've covered situations like this before. Were there isolated people that had that feeling towards you, or did the whole crowd seem to be in that mood?
South Central Los Angeles is a huge area. It's probably 5 miles by 5 miles, even bigger than that. I drove all the way into South Central Los Angeles. Absolutely no problems whatsoever. Got to that corner where these kids, mostly teenagers, had gotten to that liquor store and had looted it. And when they realized that there was no police presence whatsoever, that the media Air Force was overhead taking pictures and they were waving, they realized they had committed a major felony and they could get away with it. And once they knew they could do that, these kids who were not protesting Rodney King, these kids were on a lark, and they started something that has exploded into warfare.
As you looked around and blocks away, was there a police presence anywhere within blocks of this neighborhood?
I drove completely across South Central. I saw not one police officer. And I think that it's important to note that when I was there, the absolute fact of the matter is that driving all the way in and driving all the way out, that neighborhood was calm, it was peaceful, the people there were just as concerned about violence as anything else. It was just this one corner, and I believe, and I don't think that the chief is right about that, I think they could have gone in, they could have responded to that, there might have been some significant violence right there and then, but I rather doubt that it would have spread.
What has continued to strike me is that Rodney King was just beaten up. He was not publicly executed like we accept without much thought these days. These are more stories of property meaning more than the lives of human beings. How long can communities go with their lives having so little value before they lash out? Overall, 1 in every 17 people that are killed in the United States are killed by the police. Now, maybe during the LA riots, where more than 50 deaths were riot-related, 10 deaths resulted from state-sanctioned violence, we see an indication that when pressed, the system intensifies in violence. In all of this, we see much discussion around the topic of race, while much of the discussion around police reform gets focused on dramatic examples of disproportionate representation in the Black community. One thing I've tried to make clear is that the fundamental structure of American policing is one that must continue to grow and expand its pool of victims. White America is not safe from this tyranny. I remember when 19-year-old Zachary Hammond, out on a date, was killed in our dangerous drug war. I remember barely any media attention at the typical white, all-American boy being executed broad daylight, on camera. The system wants you to keep thinking that it protects you and only harms others in that effort. That is a lie. The staff of The Guardian published an article after the officer who killed Zachary was fired. That September 4th, 2015 article is titled, police officer who killed Zachary Hammond fired a year after shooting.
He tried to hit me. He's going to go call my PVA rep.
A police officer in South Carolina will not face criminal charges for shooting dead a young man who was driving away from a drug deal sting operation, prosecutors said on Tuesday, even as new video footage challenged his account of what happened. Lieutenant Mark Tiller of Seneca Police, who said he killed Zachary Hammond because the 19-year-old drove a car at the officer in his patrol vehicle, was cleared despite a dashboard recording showing that Hammond was shot from the side as he passed. 10th Circuit Solicitor Chrissy Adams said that while the video was troublesome and raised questions, evidence from an inquiry by the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division supported Tiller's claim that he believed he was about to be run over, meaning deadly force was justified. Zachary Hammond failed to comply with Lieutenant Tiller's orders, and as a result, he lost his life, said Adams in a letter to SLED investigators. When Hammond made the conscious decision to flee a lawful stop, he set into motion this tragic chain of events. The Department of Justice is reviewing the case for potential federal charges, which are not expected. Adams disclosed in her letter that an attempted drug deal that led to Hammond's death took place only because Hammond's female passenger, Tori Morton, accidentally sent a text message from Hammond's phone to a state trooper whose number was one digit different from her intended buyer's. Police told the trooper to play along and set up a meeting to buy marijuana and cocaine later that day in the parking lot of a local Hardee's restaurant. After arriving and buying ice cream at McDonald's, Hammond and Morton parked their Honda Civic beside an undercover police officer. "I think I'm beside you, LOL," Morton said in a final text message, which was among a batch released on Tuesday. The dashboard camera footage showed that Tiller, who had been radioed by the undercover officer, quickly sped from an adjacent street into the parking lot and tried to block Hammond's car with his own. Hammond reversed, however, and attempted to drive away. Tiller got out of his car and stood at the front of Hammond's driver's side, ordering Hammond to stop and put his hands up. Yet Hammond drove on, pushing past Tiller and forcing the officer to steady himself with one hand on the hood of Hammond's car. Tiller then fired his pistol twice in rapid succession through Hammond's driver's side window. 9 seconds had elapsed since the officer arrived. "He tried to hit me," Tiller is heard saying out of the dashboard camera's view. In a statement released in August, Tiller's attorney, John Macedo, said that after arriving, Tiller had immediately ordered Hammond to stop. Rather than abide by this order, Mr. Hammond rapidly reversed his vehicle toward Lieutenant Tiller's patrol vehicle, said Macedo. Mr. Hammond then rapidly accelerated in the direction of Lieutenant Tiller, forcing the lieutenant to push off of Mr. Hammond's car to keep from being struck and run over. The video footage shows Hammond had already begun reversing away from Tiller's patrol vehicle when the officer made his first order for the 19-year-old to stop. Hammond's Honda then drove forward and around Tiller, who opened fire while facing Hammond's front driver's side window as the car passed. Macedo said in August that Tiller shot Hammond, quote, "in order to stop the continuing threat to himself and the general public," unquote. In an email statement on Tuesday, he said Tiller agreed with Adams' decision. Quote, "As stated from day one, Lieutenant Tiller acted in self-defense, and the decision today supports this position," unquote, he said. Asked twice whether the video footage contradicted their earlier account of what happened, Macedo did not respond. Urging people not to play Monday morning quarterback, Adams ruled on Tuesday that Tiller's actions were reasonable under current law. Hammond was attempting to flee arrest, and Tiller was forced to make a split-second decision, she said. Yet in an attempt to add retrospective justification for Tiller's decision to shoot, Adams also released extensive allegations about drug dealing by Hammond, along with a detail that he had recently obtained tattoo of the word outlaw on one of his arms. She said Hammond's text message history, which officers had not seen before he was shot, disclosed that the 19-year-old, quote, had no intention of stopping for law enforcement, unquote.
The man shot and killed by a Seneca police officer last summer has reached a settlement that will keep them and the city from having to go to court.
Today they're going to explain their reasons for why they did that. 7 News reporter Addie Hampton has the answers.
The settlement reached today is bittersweet. It will not bring Zach back.
For 8 months, Angie and Paul Hammond have fought tirelessly for justice. They say at times sacrificing family and serenity. Now they have a settlement of $2.15 million and the agreement to stop litigation between themselves and Seneca Police Lieutenant Mark Tiller, his department, and the city of Seneca.
This brings an end to this chapter, and it's something we need to do to get on with our lives. We have a son who needs our attention right now.
After months in an unwanted limelight, the Hammonds say Wednesday's news conference was a necessary bookend to signify they are moving on to a more quiet life.
We live a new normal, you know, and it'll never go back to the way it was, never.
Attorney Eric Bland says a number of factors went into the settlement from their end and Lieutenant Tiller's.
Lieutenant Tiller was about to be deposed. He would have to make a decision whether he would take the Fifth Amendment or not.
Earlier this month, the judge denied Tiller's attorney's motion to postpone the deposition. Tiller still faces a federal investigation that could bring charges.
When you have those kind of serious things, that's when lawyers start to pause and their guts start to check and say, maybe we should start talking.
According to Bland, $250,000 will come from the city of Seneca's general fund. We reached out to the city to see if taxes would have to be raised on citizens in order to make the payment. They did not reply Wednesday. The rest, Bland says, is coming from the city's insurance policy. In Greenville, Addie Hampton, 7 News.
Now today, Lieutenant Mark Tiller's attorney also released a statement saying, quote, the settlement will hopefully allow everyone to begin the healing process and close a chapter that has been difficult for all parties involved.
But this isn't over because the Hamptons say they are still fighting to get dash cam video legislation passed in the state Senate that would make it harder for law enforcement to withhold those images. Keep a close eye.
I recently spoke with Zachary Hammond's mother, Angie Hammond. She was strong and confident with a charming southern drawl. But I felt the loss and helplessness behind the mask, making it difficult for me to know what to say. I have experience and knowledge that is supposed to have answers, but sometimes I just do not have them, if they even exist at all. And there's a lot more to this story, and to do it any justice, I would need to have an in-depth and dedicated series. But where I do know a little bit is back in Baltimore. Along with many other police officers that I discussed, the broken record of policing does not even protect its officers like it claims to. The system protects the system of policing, but it simply does not care about individual officers, very much like it does not care about any other members of the oppressed classes. Keith Roman, Crystal Sheffield, Sean Suter, Jermaine Cook, William Torbett, and Jakai Colson are just lost and damaged lives who have affected me personally in Baltimore. So how many of these stories are actually out there? Reading from a March 15, 2016 WBAL article titled, 3 Brothers in Custody After Prince George's County Police Officer Killed in Shootout by George Lettuce and Saliqua Khan, provides us with the media perspective.
My understanding is he opened fire on the first officer he saw and then continued that conduct as officers became aware of what was going on, and then several officers engaged him.
The attack that killed 29-year-old narcotics detective Jakai Colson happened outside the District 3 police station on Barlow Road in Palmer Park at a complex that also serves as the department's busy headquarters.
It wasn't about anything. This man launched an attack on a police station and engaged several Prince George's County police officers in a gunfight, to which they responded heroically.
The shooting came with no warning, according to Prince George's County Police Chief Hank Stawinski.
Officers weren't in the process of apprehending him or engaging him in any way.
Stawinski said the gunman who opened fire was captured at the scene of the gun battle after being wounded. The suspect is in stable condition and expected to survive. A second suspect fled and was captured outside a Popeyes restaurant less than a mile away. A woman came to the hospital saying she believed her two nephews in their early 20s, brothers from Temple Hills, were involved. She was mystified.
That's what we want to know. Why did all of this happen? What caused this? We don't know.
Her account is unconfirmed by police. Like many narcotics detectives, Ja'Kai Colson was not in regular uniform on this workday when the attack on the District 3 station that claimed his life began.
And this is an act of cowardice.
An unwarranted, unprovoked attack on our police officers at a police station. Absolutely unprecedented and unacceptable.
The fatal shot that killed a Prince George's County police officer during a shootout involving three brothers was friendly fire, Prince George's County Police Chief Hank Stawinski said. Officer Ja'Kai Colson had been with the department for 4 years and was just shy of his 29th birthday. It's my sad duty that I have to share with you. We believe that the fired round that led to Colson's death was from a fellow officer, Stawinski said. At this moment, I am characterizing the shot as errant because it wasn't at a threat. But I'm not going to say that it was a misfire. That's what the investigation, the forensic evidence will tell us. An autopsy Monday revealed that Colson was inadvertently shot by a fellow responding officer during the gun battle, police said. Stawinski did not identify which officer fired the deadly shot. He did identify the shooter as 22-year-old Michael DeAndre Ford. Stawinski said Ford and his brothers had conversations about engaging in a shootout with police around 4:17 p.m. And around 4:30 p.m. shots were fired at the District 3 police station complex, which is attached to headquarters in a residential part of Landover. The shooter fired at two passing cars, an ambulance with two EMTs inside, the police building, and at officers, police said. During the incident, officers used incredible restraint, especially with homes around the area, when Stawinski said that Ford began confronting officers with unprovoked shots. Ja'Kai was senselessly taken from us, Prince George's County Chief Hank Stawinski said. Colson was on his way to the police station to meet an officer and arrived right after Michael Ford began his shooting spree. Colson left his unmarked cruiser and began exchanging gunfire with the shooter, police said. While Colson drew attention in his direction, other officers were in a position to neutralize the threat, Stawinski said. Colson immediately engages with the shooter as he exits that vehicle, Stawinski said. He's dressed in civilian clothes. He's not wearing body armor. He's not prepared for a firefight that he's just arrived at. Stawinski said while one of the four brothers was engaged in the shootout, the other brothers used their cell phones to record the incident. He said although each brother had the opportunity to notify police or call 911 prior to the incident, no one did. The brothers were identified as 21-year-old Malik Ford and 18-year-old Elijah Ford. Colson was shot when he and other officers rushed outside and exchanged gunshots with the brothers. Police shot Michael Ford. He remains hospitalized with what are considered non-life-threatening injuries, police said. It was Colson's actions that allowed officers to take a position where they could intervene and neutralize the threat detected. Stawinski said. Colson drew fire to himself and in doing so was mortally wounded. Ford did not expect to survive the shooting, Stawinski said. Police said they have cell phone video which captured the gunman dictating his last will and testament. That video was recorded just minutes before his two brothers drove him to the District 3 station. I heard like 4 shots, went upstairs, heard 25 more shots, and saw the guy all shot up. I guess the officer was up more, said Dimitri Jackson, who lives nearby. Police asked Elijah and Malik Ford where Michael Ford was, and they stated they did not know, even though the video recorded by Elijah Ford clearly shows Michael Ford hiding behind a police van, officials said. Malik and Elijah Ford continued to maintain sight of their brother as he shot at more police officers until Michael Ford was shot, officials said. Following the ambush, Malik and Elijah Ford fled the scene. The driver, Malik Ford, turned himself in to police at nearby fast food restaurant shortly after the shooting spree. Elijah Ford was taken into custody at his home in Landover shortly after his brother. Officials said Michael Ford was charged Tuesday with murder, 11 counts of attempted murder, 3 counts of first-degree assault, and 3 counts of use of a handgun and conspiracy as a result of Sunday's incident. He's being held on a no-bond status, officials said. Police said as the investigation progresses, additional charges will be brought against the 3 brothers regarding the victims in the vehicles, which was captured on cell phone surveillance video. By nightfall Sunday, Colson's brothers and sisters in blue prayed outside Prince George's Hospital Center, where he eventually died. By daylight Monday, detectives still pored over where multiple shots were fired, and they appeared interested in a black sedan parked at the scene. A total of 4 police officers discharged their duty weapons while trying to stop the shooter. 2 additional officers also responded, but did not fire their weapons. The involved officers were identified as P.O. Brian Maludas, Corporal Jason Wells, Police Officer First Class Tyler Krause, Corporal John Weinkoop, Police Officer Matthew Scott, Police Officer First Class Ja'Kai Colson. Fighting back tears in an emotional statement, Stawinski said, "I love this police department. I love this family," he said. Ja'Kai was senselessly taken from us. Colson grew up in Pennsylvania. A 4-year veteran of the force, he did undercover drug investigations. Police do not believe that the shooter targeted him in particular. Funeral arrangements for Colson's line of duty death will be shared with our community when finalized. He is survived by his parents, James and Sheila Colson, and younger brother, Jariah. He grew up in Boothwyn, Pennsylvania. Flags outside police headquarters are at half-staff. Memorial black tape is on every police cruiser, and the public have begun paying their respects for the fallen officer.
Thou art scattering, full and free.
Ja'Kai lived his call, boots on the ground, as they say, with daily service in all that he did. He lived very much in the present. Here at RMC, Ja'Kai's call meant he embodied a deep commitment to our community. His work with Brothers for Change is still talked about to this day. Whether he was helping children or the elderly or his fellow students on campus, he didn't hold back. He was never too busy to pitch in and lead the charge. And by living this way, knowing his call and living it without hesitation, he inspired others, many others, to do the same in fellowship with one another. He made the college and our wider community better and more rich because he was a part of it.
Me
One reason why these stories do not get more attention from the nation and within policing is that they end up just being part of the regular cycle of events. It's so familiar that it does not even stand out. On some level, we know police are allowed to kill whenever they perceive a threat. Proceed. There is no requirement for there to be an actual threat or even for a reasonable person to believe there was a threat. The legal standard is now whether or not the typical officer thought it was reasonable to perceive a threat. I hope that stands out as the ridiculous standard that it is. This ridiculous standard allowed some extreme shit to become normalized, like the homicide of Philando Castile. Very little has affected me on a raw emotional level as hearing the voice of the young girl who sat in the back seat and witnessed police kill Philando Castile right in front of her and her mother. That little girl then garnered the strength to comfort her distraught mother in the back of the police car. It is truly heartbreaking and an awe-inspiring display of courage. Experts weigh in on the video of Philando Castile shooting by Julie Bosman and Mitch Smith in the New York Times on June 21, 2017. Guys, discussion this time. The police officer who fatally shot Philando Castile along a Minnesota road was acquitted of all charges last week. But newly released video of what happened that day has opened new debate over the case and how a seemingly routine traffic stop so abruptly turned deadly. We asked experts in law, police procedures, and officer training to view the dashboard camera video of the encounter between Officer Guillermo Yanez and Mr. Castile, an episode that lasted only seconds. They offered their takes on what they saw, frame by frame. Here are some of what they said. The approach.
Yes, sir.
Officer Yanez radios to a colleague that Mr. Castile, a driver inside a car he has followed, matches the description of a robbery suspect from several days earlier, but he walks up to the Oldsmobile calmly. A second officer approaches on the other side. Gary F. McCarthy, a former Chicago police superintendent, notes, "The officer got too close to the passenger's window. If I thought he was a robbery suspect, I would have had my hand on my gun. The tactics were a little laissez-faire if you thought you were dealing with an armed robbery suspect." Jeffrey J. Noble, a former California police officer, testified on behalf of the prosecution in Minnesota in a report on Mr. Castile's death, states, "If Officer Yanez had a reasonable belief that Mr. Castile was a suspect in an armed robbery, he should have employed a high-risk car stop, and to do otherwise would be inconsistent with generally accepted police practices." The conversation.
Good. How are you? Good. Reason I put you over, your brake lights are out. So you only have one active brake light, and that's going to be your passenger side one. Your third brake light, which is up here on top, and then this one back here, is going to be out. You have your license and insurance?
I do have a firearm on me.
Don't reach for it then.
Officer Yanez tells Mr. Castile his brake light is out, and Mr. Castile hands over his insurance card. During the conversation, Mr. Castile calmly tells Officer Yanez, "Sir, I have to tell you, I do have a firearm on me." David A. Klinger, a professor of criminology and criminal justice at the University of Missouri St. Louis and a former Los Angeles police officer, he notes, "That's where the officer has to freeze it and get everything to stop. Oh, there's a gun involved now. Let's reframe the situation and make it safe for everybody." Jeffrey P. Alpert, a professor at the University of South Carolina who studies high-risk police activity and police violence, notes, "You go into the head of the driver, and he's apparently trying to be honest and straightforward. He was probably thinking, I'll be a good guy and show the officer my carry card, and this will all be over. What was happening in the officer's mind was different. Maybe the officer thought he was going for the gun. Paul Butler, a law professor at Georgetown University and former federal prosecutor, the victim did everything right, everything he was supposed to do. The victim was very respectful, very polite, letting the officer know what he was doing. None of that made a difference. The shooting.
Don't pull it out. Don't pull it out. Don't pull it out! Don't move! Fuck! 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 Don't move! Don't move! Don't move! Code 3! Get the baby girl out of here! Fuck! Don't move!
Officer Yanez yells at Mr. Castillo not to reach for his gun. Mr. Castillo tries to assure him that he is not. Officer Yanez fires 7 shots. Later he will say he thought Mr. Castillo was reaching for his gun. Mr. Castillo's girlfriend has said he was trying to pull out his identification as the officer had requested. The video camera, mounted on the police car behind Mr. Castillo's car, does not give a view of what happens in the front seat or where Mr. Castillo is reaching. Mr. Klinger, the professor and former officer, comments. Could there be something that would lead reasonable jurors to have reasonable doubt? We can't see what happened inside the vehicle. It was entirely possible that was the basis for the acquittal. The jurors might have said he had a gun and he might have been reaching for it. Linda Hatchett, the lawyer for the Castillo family, she commented. I believe that he panicked, that he was totally out of control, and because of that, Philando lost his life. If he had concerns about the weapon, say then, show me both your hands. Put both your hands on the steering wheel. The aftermath.
Fuck! 6921, give up! Back here, call 3! Shots fired! Fuck! Max, call 3!
We got pulled over for a busted tail light in the back. And the police, he's scared. They took my boyfriend. His license, he's carried the license to carry. He was trying to get out his ID and his wallet out his pocket. And he let the officer know that he had a firearm and he was reaching for the wallet. And the officer got
Ma'am, just keep your hands where they are! Fuck! Oh, I told him not to reach for it! I told him to get his hand open!
Oh my God. Please don't tell my boyfriend.
Just keep your hands where they are, please!
I will, sir. My hands where they are. Four bullets into him, sir. He was just getting his registration, sir.
Get the female passenger out!
Ma'am, exit the car right now with your hands up. You see your hands? Exit now. Keep them up. Keep them up. Where's my gun? Stop my gun. Exit me and walk backwards. Walk backwards.
Officer Yanez calls for an ambulance and keeps his gun pointed at the car. Diamond Reynolds, Mr. Castillo's girlfriend, begins broadcasting the scene on Facebook from the passenger seat. Another officer removes Miss Reynolds' young daughter from the car. Mr. Klinger, professor and former police officer, again comments. Afterwards, he is very emotionally wrought place. He's screaming into his mic. There's no composure. He did not present a very professional demeanor. Mr. McCarthy, the former police superintendent, he also commented. I thought it was really positive that the officer removed the child from the back seat. He's trying to assess what the heck just happened. I thought that was the best thing he could do at that point. Mr. Butler, the former prosecutor, noted. Part of what may have made a difference to the jury was the officer's very emotional reaction after the shooting. He's somebody who realizes he's made a grievous mistake. It's certainly an argument for a manslaughter conviction rather than a murder conviction. People who do harm in the heat of the moment still deserve punishment.
My son would never jeopardize anyone else's life by trying to pull a gun on an officer and the gun was not fire ready. These are some of the facts that came out in the trial, and I am so very, 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 very disappointed in the system here in the state of Minnesota, because nowhere in the world do you die from being honest and telling the truth. Now, these are some things that you need to know and recognize. There has always been a systemic problem in the state of Minnesota, and me thinking with my common sense that we would get justice in this case, but nevertheless, it never seems to fail us. The system continues to fail black people, and they will continue to fail you all. Like I said, because this happened with Orlando, when they get done with us, they're coming from you, for you, and all your interracial children. Y'all are next, and you'll be standing up here fighting for justice just as well as I am. I am so disappointed in the state of Minnesota. My son loved this state. He had one tattoo on his body, and it was of the Twin Cities, the state of Minnesota with TC on it. My son loved this city, and this city killed my son, and the murderer gets away. Are you kidding me right now? We're not evolving as a civilization. We're devolving. We have taken steps forward. People have died for us to have these rights, and now we're devolving. We're going back down to 1969. Damn! What is it gonna take? I'm mad as hell right now. Yes, I am. My firstborn one son died here in Minnesota. Under the circumstances, just because he was a police officer, that makes it okay. Oh, now they got free reign. He's found innocent on all counts. He's shot into a car with no regard to human life, and that's okay. Thank you, Minnesota. Thank you, Minnesota. That's all I have to say.
Regardless of how you police as an individual or what the policies of your department are, this is what policing is, legally. This is the system and institution in action, right in front of you.
Fuck! Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh, dude!
Going back to the first pillar of American policing, the creation and maintenance of oppressed classes, from which resources are extracted to institute the oppression. This is a complicated discussion to have, but I've tried to get into it somewhat. Races were created to divide us, to make us tribal and look at one another as the competition instead of the elite. It is power maintenance for the oligarchy 101. Understandably, many of the oppressed took on those identities with a sense of pride instead of allowing those terms, such as black, to keep a negative association. While admirable, the tool of oppression is the label themselves. It does not matter whether they have a positive or negative association for them to successfully serve the will of the elite. When a race becomes part of your identity, you are the tool of the elite and an enabler of racism. I know it's a tough issue. And this is how racism becomes normal. And the oppressed get regressive taxes and civil asset forfeitures to fund those tools of oppression. And all of it comes together to keep us blind. Shouldn't we know this? Shouldn't the police know this? There are always reasons. During my research, one of the peer-reviewed articles that I cite is in the Journal of Criminal Justice Education, titled Ignoring the Past, Coverage of Slavery and Slave Patrols in Criminal Justice Texts by K.B. Turner, Giacopassi, Margaret Van Dyke. Traditionally in research, we cite the most recent articles, but this 2006 article is being used to show just how long we have known this stuff and done nothing about it. Here are two sections from the discussion and conclusion sections, respectively. Our analysis of the content of criminal justice textbooks makes clear that there is a lack of emphasis on multiculturalism and historical perspective, at least insofar as the subject of slavery is concerned. Our review reveals that most textbooks ignore or nearly ignore slavery, the role of criminal justice in maintaining the institution of slavery, and the importance of slave patrols in helping to shape the modern system of policing in America. The encouraging aspect of the study is that in comparison to texts published in the 1970s that almost totally omitted any discussion of slavery, half of the modern introductory textbooks and over 2/3 of the policing texts mention slavery or some closely related topic. In most cases, however, the coverage was perfunctory. The paucity of coverage in police texts concerning the relationship of slavery and slave patrols to American policing is more surprising given that the police component of the criminal justice system arguably receives the most attention. The law enforcement component is by far the most visible and perhaps the most controversial of the criminal justice system. Yet documentation of the complete history of American law enforcement is deficient in most criminal justice law enforcement texts. Omission of these topics might be understandable if the purpose of the introductory police texts were simply to provide a systems approach describing the components of the criminal justice system, its actors, processes by which offenders are arrested, adjudicated, and punished. However, most of the texts contain discussions of the history of the various components of criminal justice system and historical development of the important elements of law. It appears then that the texts do strive to give context and perspective to the material. We conclude that most do a poor job in the area of slavery. And our review of 18 current Introduction to Criminal Justice textbooks to assess their coverage of criminal justice issues related to slavery and its potential relevance to modern policing practices documents very limited coverage. Only 9 of the texts mention slavery, slave patrols, or other slavery-related topics. Of the 9 texts that mention the issue, the coverage was judged minimal, with a median of 8 lines per text devoted to the topic. Of the 13 police textbooks that were reviewed, 4 failed to mention slavery or slave patrols. Of those that discuss slavery's relevance to the development of law enforcement, the median was 22 lines devoted to the topic. We conclude that introductory criminal justice and policing texts continue to largely ignore the relevance of race and history in the development and contemporary practice of law and criminal justice. If it is true that one can only understand the present by understanding the past, the introductory texts in particular are failing to provide an adequate foundation to enable students to grasp the complexities of the criminal justice system's operation in a multicultural society. An honest discussion of the relationship between slavery and early policing should find its way into Introduction to Criminal Justice and Policing textbooks to enable students to better comprehend both the historical development and contemporary operation of American policing. Continuation of this line of research is important to increase criminologists' awareness of the limitations of our approach to the subject matter. We do a disservice to our students if we present them with monocultural and ahistorical texts. I never like to imply intentionality, but ultimately, I hope it is becoming clear that this is how the system works. It can happen all in the background, becoming part of our individual identities and group collective thought. We have already discussed a few examples of the second pillar, the valuing superior class property over the lives of oppressed classes. Many people know this now, but legally the police have no obligation to protect the public. None. But mayors and politicians, they have an oligarchy to serve, and the elite have property to protect.
Central ladder pipe stand. Let's give it a few minutes, see what we're looking at. 16 copy.
Box Farm 23-81, your operations are fire ground. West Saratoga Street, North Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, fully involved, right 8. Engine 36, squad 26, engine 20 is the RIT. Engine 21, engine 51. Truck 25, truck 20, medic 23. Battalion Chief 19, Battalion Chief 18 respond. West Saratoga Street, North Martin Luther King on the right 8. Box Bar 23-81, your operations are fire ground 2-1. Engine 36, squad 26, engine 20 is the RIT. Engine 21, engine 51. Truck 25, truck 20, medic 23. Battalion Chief 19, Battalion Chief 18 respond. West Saratoga Street and North Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, fully involved, right 8 at 140. 31 respond on box 14-70, 2109 West Craig Street on the South Pulaski and Airport Street on the building fire.
Pay close attention to the reported reasons why former police commissioner Anthony Batts was fired from his command in this July 2015 article by CNN titled, "Baltimore Police Commissioner Removed in Response to Riots." Baltimore Police Commissioner Anthony Batts has been removed from his position as top cop, the city's mayor announced Wednesday. Batts drew widespread criticism for his response to riots that erupted after the April death of Freddie Gray, a young black man in police custody. Deputy Police Commissioner Kevin Davis will become interim commissioner, according to a statement from Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake. The move came as the city's police union said in a report that the riots were preventable and fueled by the passive stance adopted by Batts and top commanders, claiming police brass put the image of themselves and City Hall ahead of the safety of its citizens and public servants. The Baltimore City Fraternal Order of Police Lodge 3 released its report on the same day that the law enforcement advocacy group, the Police Executive Research Forum, began its own review of the riot response, a review requested by Batts. City and police officials have repeatedly denied that any stand-down order was given in response to the demonstration after Gray's death on April 19th. The police department did not immediately respond to a request for comment, but the spokesman for Rawlings Blake said it was disappointing that the FOP continues to issue baseless and false information instead of working with us to find solutions that will protect our officers. Spokesman Kevin Harris said the city hoped the police union's review would shed some additional light on how we can better prepare our officers should there be future unrest. Instead, this report is no more than a trumped-up political document full of baseless accusations, anger pointing, and personal attacks. FOP Lodge 3 President Gene Ryan said in a news conference that the city's response to the rioting was politically motivated and uncaring, a CNN affiliate WBAL reported. The union's review was undertaken because rank-and-file officers do not want to see Baltimore burn again, he said. The 32-page report said officers did not have the proper equipment, training, and leadership to respond to the days of unrest that resulted in injuries to more than 200 officers and millions of dollars in property damage. It also said the police department's criminal intelligence section was severely hampered by the understaffing of trained detectives. Before and during the riots, Police Commissioner Batts and his top commanders adopted a passive stance that put the image of themselves and City Hall ahead of the safety of its citizens and public servants, the police union report said. This tentative posture allowed the destruction of personal property and needless injury to first responders. The question begs now, is the Baltimore Police Department prepared for the next potential unrest? Gray, 25, was arrested on a weapons charge April 12th, but suffered a severe spinal cord injury while in police custody that led to his death 7 days later. 6 police officers have been charged in connection with his death. All have pleaded not guilty. Violent protests broke out in some parts of the city following Gray's death. Harris said the FOP's report rushed to conclusions before all of the necessary information was gathered about the police response to the protests, which is a disservice to our officers who acted so courageously during the unrest. A city review of the protests will be extensive, independent, and consists of all the facts, Harris said in a statement. The police union report said Batts and his command staff gave officers, quote, direct orders not to engage any protesters, quote, and, quote, allow the protesters room to destroy and allow the destruction of property so the rioters would appear to be the aggressors. In addition, the National Guard should have been called in sooner, according to the FOP report. Decisions implemented by top commanders of the Baltimore Police Department left officers in harm's way, making them vulnerable and susceptible to attack, the report concluded. The majority of officers we spoke to felt the Baltimore Police Department did not give them the necessary support to do their jobs effectively. The mayor's office said the city has already identified and corrected some weaknesses, including the need to update how we assess the effectiveness of our riot gear and in order to begin the process of placing cameras in the backs of all police transport vans. Now is a time for healing, a time for progress. This report offers neither, the mayor's spokesman added in his statement. The mayor remains committed to working with the officers of the city to seek solutions and push for the safer city we all believe is possible.
We stand not just for Baltimore, we stand with our comrades in Ferguson, in Staten Island, in Cleveland, in North Charleston, South Carolina, in Sanford, Florida, to say injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Until all of us are free. None of us are free. None of us are free. Until all of us are free. Until all of us are free. Tell the truth and stop the lies. Ready, break, and let the die. Tell the truth and stop the lies. Ready, break, and let the die. Tell the truth and stop the lies. Ready, break, and let the die.
Now let's just go and restate a couple of lines. Batts drew widespread criticism for his response to riots. Yes, his response to the riots, the threat to property, but not the lives lost at the hands of police, specifically Freddie Gray in this instance. And then amazingly, they put in Kevin Davis, who was worse and met the same fate, eventually. The riots were preventable and fueled by the passive stance adopted by Batts. If only the police had used more violence on the oppressed classes, then more of the elite's property would have been protected. Rawlings Blake said it was disappointing that the FOP continues to issue baseless and false information instead of working with us to find solutions that will protect our officers. Again, a strange non-mention of the issues the protests were about. The union's review was undertaken because rank-and-file officers do not want to see Baltimore burn again, he said. And once again, we are not concerned about the lives lost to the misapplication of state violence. We are not talking about the dramatic need to not kill people under the color of the law. Our officers who acted so courageously during the unrest. Courageously doing what? Protecting property? And never a mention of actually doing a better job protecting people who are not cops. It's right on the surface. These are the cries of the victims of a system that works against the greater good of society. There are many victims that have no voice and are never heard, going back to America's original sin, the third pillar of U.S. policing, the continued genocide of the indigenous nations of North America. Sticking to the peer-reviewed sources, next we are reading a paper from Northern Arizona University's Barbara Perry titled From Ethnocide to Ethnoviolence, Layers of Native American Victimization in the Contemporary Justice Review in 2002. most remarkable conclusion to be drawn from the foregoing discussion is that Native Americans continue to be verbally and physically victimized 500 years after first contact. In spite of, or perhaps because of advances made in economic, political, social, and cultural recognition, Native Americans still evoke hostility and violence. But as the title of this paper suggests, the nature and locus of that violence have changed. We have seen a shift from collective forms of genocide to ethnocide and individualized acts of ethnoviolence. Middle-level violence, such as localized violence in reaction to rights assertions and police brutality, remains the same. The racial violence that persists is less aligned with consciously orchestrated state policy than with a loosely organized anti-Indian movement and racist individuals. Nonetheless, even bigots are informed by broader patterns of a Euro-American cultural imperialism that continues to inform Native and non-Native interaction. Much of white America clings to the remnants of the mythologies of manifest destiny and white supremacy, albeit in somewhat muted forms. To justify its treatment of American Indians, according to the prevailing mantra, the land and its resources are theirs by right, and besides, Native Americans are incapable of using this land and its resources efficiently. Native Americans are savages, lazy, dependent, unfairly privileged, and therefore in need of white protection and guidance. Because of these hostile paternalistic sentiments, Native Americans have been in turn marginalized, decultured, assaulted, and even massacred. Efforts by Native Americans to change this negative imagery and other related forms of oppression have elicited remarkably consistent patterns of white reactions. Native American nations and individuals who have resisted white encroachment have been harassed, relocated, persecuted, beaten, prosecuted, and exterminated. For Native Americans, the politics of seeking human recognition has been a dangerous game. Struggles over identity, worth, and sovereignty continue throughout Indian country, thereby threatening fundamental qualities of American Indian life and folkways. Traditional ways of living and interacting with the world have been challenged legally and as frequently, extra-legally, through violence. This has been especially evident in the continuing contest over land and resources growing out of a conflict between two very different cultures, two incongruent sets of values, and two divergent perspectives on the same geographical area. In terms of action taken, the contemporary anti-Indian movement seeks to deprive Native Americans of the few rights ceded in exchange for massive tracts of land, on and off-reservation fish and game rights, mineral resource rights, and water rights. It seeks to eliminate once and for all any claim Native Americans may have to what little remains by treaty and natural right. But as we have seen, in spite of this kind of violence, Native Americans remain viable peoples. In fact, they are currently enjoying a resurgence of numbers and a nationalist identity which has provided them with a new sense of significance and purpose. The activism which has been at the root of so much violence and the backlash associated with it has engendered a renewed pride in American Indian identity. With this has come a recognition of the need to pursue what is theirs by right. In short, it has mobilized Native Americans around their cultural identity and political sovereignty. The histories and identities of Native Americans are unique among minority groups in the United States. Consequently, their struggle to overcome the legacy of ethnocide and ethnoviolence must also be culturally specific. They can draw a unique form of strength from the existence of tribal political entities across the United States and in Canada and Mexico as well. The key for them is a collective rather than localized mobilization of political will. Just as the anti-Indian movement has been able to muster a collective voice, so too can Native American communities react strategically on a national and global level to demand enforcement of hate crime and civil rights legislation, to educate against bigotry, and to engage in a campaign against the misinformation and mythology that contribute to ethnoviolence. But this must be part of a broader agenda that includes the attainment of Native sovereignty. Freelander and Shelby has encouraged Native Americans to take up the challenge they face just on individual reservations, but collectively and nationwide. It should come as no surprise that I found myself a prominent figure up in Standing Rock, North Dakota during the DAPL pipeline dispute. What that experience let me know is how complicated this entire topic is. There are so many layers that I am wholly incapable of explaining the history and interactions that have taken place and are ongoing. This is what our system does. That is what I know. And that brutality in Standing Rock demonstrated all three pillars of American policing in high-def true realism. Yes, I keep saying system and institutions because while individuals can break the trend, the system creates the patterns. We should not be looking at outliers as explanatory causes. I just do not care how many racists have badges on their chest, and neither should you. What matters is how many racist actions occur with a badge on the chest. Rotten apples miss the point entirely. I suppose this is as good a time as any to go a little bit more into the rotten apples concept with a video that I did a while back on that darn TYT network. And yeah, it is what it is. Too late now, but here goes.
Please don't tell me this, Lord. Please, Jesus, don't tell me that he's gone. Please don't tell me that he's gone. Please, officer, don't tell me that you just did this to him. You shot 4 bullets into him, sir. He was just getting his license and registration, sir.
I am serious. Oh my God. Hey, Rick, Josh, on your face. Oh shit. Touch me.
As I watched the murder of 12-year-old Tamir Rice at the hands of Cleveland police, I questioned everything about my decade of being a police and was driven to study police science and find solutions. This drive came from a moral imperative that continues to burn at my soul. From the day I joined the Marines at age 17, I had dedicated my life to service. But what were my efforts for? I had to face the words of 18th century criminologist Cesar Beccaria. Liberty is at an end whenever the law permits that in certain cases a man may cease to be a person and become a thing, or in more familiar terms, a perp, a thug, convict, inmate number 2926. In this quest for solutions, the hardest pill to swallow has been that the desire to avenge Tamir and punish his killer will do nothing to protect the next child from being murdered. Finding ways to protect other children from being killed at the hands of police is the only way to ensure that Tamir Rice did not die in vain. And it isn't just that we know punishment is not an effective deterrent, as demonstrated in everything from drug dealing and capital murder to spousal abuse and theft. It's that focusing on individuals perpetuates the mentality that officers who break the law and brutalize suspects are just bad apples, which is an inaccurate reflection of our policing institutions. If we allow ourselves to just blame the bad apples, we deny the need for the hard work required for an ethical society. This makes me call upon the words of the author of The Middle Passage, Charles Johnson. We can't be bound by the past, but we must not be blind to it either. In American policing, all of our apples are contained in a rotting system. Continuing with the apple analogy, the systems and institutions of policing are the barrels we place the apples in, and these systems were crafted to create and maintain oppressed classes while extracting resources from those oppressed classes to fund their very oppression, to protect the property of the wealthy, and to continue the genocide of the Native American nations. The planks of the policing barrel have been seasoned throughout time with slavery, treaty violations, crime bills, mass incarceration, environmental poisoning, Jim Crow, regressive taxation, and more. Any serious attempt at police reform can't focus just on punishing the bad apples. It has to attack the barrel itself. Because of the rotting and corrupting barrel, even the best measures to control the police use of violence cannot compete with the ultimately corrupting influence of the barrel. This applies from every police reform, from body cameras to disciplinary review boards. Look for future videos from me where I'll lay out my solutions to the problems of urban policing in America, a solution known as civilian-led policing. We actually know these answers, but we can fear ourselves into inaction. I'm Michael Wood Jr. Look at the show notes below to find out how you can get more involved and take a stand. Of no surprise at this point, none of that get involved stuff applies any longer. Nearly 150,000 views, but no traction. I cannot help but wonder why I continue to do this when I am apparently so ineffective. Time to get into my 4 correlations to violence that I'm always harping. A recent research study that was published that supported the theory once again, this time in Australia. Also, keep in mind that the Middle East, specifically Yemen and Iraq, still use leaded gasoline. So this time we will read from a 2016 article in Environmental Health by Mark Patrick Taylor, Miriam Forbes, Brian Opetskin, Nick Perrin, and Bruce Lamphere, which is titled The Relationship Between Atmospheric Lead Emission and Aggressive Crime, an Ecological Study. Our study tested the hypothesis that there is a significant correlation between air lead exposure and rates of aggressive crime later in life. The results demonstrate that after controlling for major socio-demographic correlates of crime, there is a strong positive relationship between lead and air levels and subsequent crime rates. This has important implications for public health globally. This is the first Australian study to test the hypothesis that lead exposure is associated with subsequent aggressive criminal behaviors at a range of spatial scales. Lead in air concentrations accounted for 29.8% of the variance in assault rates 21 years later in the 6 localities measured, after adjusting for socio-demographic covariates. In the most populous Austrian states of NSW, which is New South Wales, and Victoria, total lead petrol emissions accounted for 34.6 and 32.6, respectively, of the variance in death by assault rates 18 years later. Given the variety of possible determinants of criminal behavior, these are remarkable findings. This study found a robust relationship between lead in air and subsequent rates of aggressive crime at suburb, state, and national population levels using multiple analytic methods and data sources. These results add to the existing body of literature that highlights sequelae, connection, of lead exposure. Fortunately, exposure to lead is preventable and remedial intervention is cost-effective. Given the overwhelming evidence that there is no safe lower threshold for lead toxicity, remediation programs are essential to mitigate these effects and should be a clear priority for immediate policy change. Do you understand what this study is saying? In no uncertain terms, just the lead poisoning aspect of environmental poisoning accounts for approximately 33% of violence, and this type of influence is found all over the world and across race, culture, and any other variable you throw at it. And to make it worse, it can all be fixed if only we actually cared. Like the New York City Public Health Department. If only police departments actually fought crime and worked to protect the people from which their power is derived. The next strongest correlates are inequality, local instability, and violence as a deterrent and control style police. Inequality of resources and local instabilities are often closely linked and represented in this recent peer-reviewed study. Preferences for group dominance track and mediate the effects of macro-level social inequality and violence across societies by Jonas Kunz, Richard Fisher, Jim Sedaris, and Lot Thompson. It is a paper from Princeton University and was published in 2017. We have demonstrated that across countries, the average hegemonic motives among members of the dominant group track micro-indices of the impaired population outcomes accompanying structural inequality. A lack of social progress to meet the basic needs of the general population, greater disparities in happiness between different groups and in opportunities between genders, the absence of democracy and press freedom, as well as the risk of violent conflicts and poor governance, corruption, instability, and the absence of rule of law. In the face of such dire population outcomes, why is the motivation for hegemony among the dominant group not reduced, but enhanced. We posit that members of dominant groups respond to cues of social inequality with increased dominance motives because they indicate better individual payoff and chances of success. Data collected across U.S. states in Study 2 confirm that this tuning of dominance motivates to macrostructural inequality and presence of violence, as well as its subsequent effects on willingness to enforce the hegemonic status quo violently, do indeed happen at the psychological level of individual agents. Collective level effects of social climate may still occur across countries with greater normative variation than is in the case with the U.S. The present results, however, demonstrate that a psychological route operates through the hegemonic motives of individuals. Our multi-level analyses found evidence of indirect cross-level effects for all 5 of the dependent variables, and statistical models that assumed macro-level variables to have downstream effects via SDO on individual level attitudes and behaviors clearly outperformed models of reverse causality. Still, the cross-sectional nature of our data mandates caution in interpreting causal direction. Indeed, scores of previous studies demonstrate that SDO both responds to and boosters group dominance, suggesting that reciprocal causal processes may also operate with respect to macrostructural inequality, reproducing the hegemonic status quo. Why, then, is rebellion by subordinate groups not more common in the face of rapidly increasing inequality across the world? Our present data were comprised of responses from members of dominant groups only, and so cannot address this question empirically. As is the case for individual agents, however, even though subordinate groups are placed at considerable disadvantage in a between-group hierarchy, both dominant and subordinate groups benefit from avoiding costly dominance conflicts when the outcome is likely given beforehand. Hence, if challenging the hegemonic status quo is costly and unlikely to be successful, individual members of subordinate groups may do better by accepting and not disputing their lot, as psychological experiments on system justification confirm. To conclude, the present research demonstrates that people's preference for group-based social hierarchies are reflected in institutional functioning and national character, and hence have important social and political implications for both micro and macro level analyses. The data suggests that societal level group-based hierarchies and the consequent socio-political inequality and impaired socio-political functioning and population outcomes extends to and are reflected in the minds of national populations through basic preferences for group-based hegemony. This general preference for group hegemony in turn motivates ideologies, behaviors, and even greater support for out-group violence that stabilizes the societal status quo. The relationship between crime and communities has long been a focal point of criminological and sociological investigation. From the groundwork laid by the Chicago School in the 1920s, the neighborhood effects literature has examined how neighborhood context affects the individual level behavior of residents, as well as the macro level outcome for neighborhoods such as crime and violence. In particular, social disorganization theorists argue that racial and ethnic composition, poverty, and residential instability all influence the local crime rate by disrupting residential networks that are positive factors, protective factors against crime. Now, this article contains a lot of jargon that, a lot of the particular kind of jargon that invades scholarly endeavors and messes up our ability to effectively communicate with the world. What they are trying to say is how interlaced all of the correlates are. One of the fundamental ways that makes us tribal is that it makes us tribal. Since we have been grouped by these labels, we end up feeling like there is safety in the familiarity of the grouping, and thus integrated by closing ranks and identifying as the label, the most influential of which is race in our social context. Grouping into these labels literally contributes to the stresses that make people feel as though they need to close ranks. It's a vicious cycle.
What about the child who comes from an inadequate home where he gets no encouragement from his parents, where he doesn't have enough to wear, he doesn't have enough to eat, He comes to school hungry. He comes to school without having any experience in the past with books, anyone at home to help him. The attitude of the family is that of frustration and despair.
We are hoping that in the daycare center, a demonstration research project to give these children an opportunity to have the experiences, social and educational, to better prepare them for the first grade and later education. These children of this particular area, without this experience, would be spending most of their time in the homes which are not equipped to give them the type of advantages which we are at the daycare center. It is our hope that by giving these children preschool experience, they will be ready for learning when they do enter the first grade.
The local instability portion comes in many forms, but let's try and see it from a different angle. Another peer-reviewed article, but this one from the criminal justice field. Egbert Zavala writes in Crime and Delinquency in November 2010 in the article, testing the link between child maltreatment and family violence among police officers. The purpose of this study is to document the relationship between physical abuse during childhood and family violence among a group of police officers from the Baltimore Police Department in the United States. Analyzing data from the Police and Domestic Violence and Police Families in Baltimore, Maryland, 1997 to 1999, this study found a positive relationship between physical abuse and family violence towards spouses and children. Specifically, the study found that police officers who indicated that their parents were physical with them were more likely to report being physical with their spouse and children. They were also more likely to report yelling or shouting toward family members. This study shows a positive relationship between physical abuse and involvement in family violence and increases our knowledge regarding the cycle of violence in police families. This study points to the need for better recognition of physical abuse and the negative consequences children are likely to endure. Now, I know that in many circles this information will be treated as a, yeah, duh, of course. But it remains crucial that we see which things are supported by science and data as opposed to old wives' tales and so-called common sense or conventional wisdom. Many sources of violence are well known and have been for a long time. Again, I ask, why is your police department not fighting these causes? And lastly, before we wrap up this long podcast, the police and violence part.
Put your hands up! Put your hands up! On the ground! Get on the ground!
At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States found itself at war with first Spain and then the Philippines. These foreign interventions set the tone for future American foreign policy. Writing around this time, Mark Twain gave an ominous warning about foreign policy by a great republic. But it was impossible to save the Great Republic. She was rotten to the heart. Lust of conquest had long ago done its work. Trampling upon the helpless abroad had taught her, by a natural process, to endure with apathy the like at home. Multitudes who had applauded the crushing of other people's liberties lived to suffer for their mistake in their own persons.
The natural process Twain describes occurs through a framework we call the boomerang effect. In the absence of strong formal constraints, tactics used in foreign interventions abroad are later used to limit the liberties of people back home. Like a boomerang, the U.S. government aims its policies abroad only for them to return back to the United States. This occurs through the development of human capital, physical capital, and an interventionist mindset, which are necessary to control others.
One illustration of the boomerang effect is the militarization of domestic policing. Historically, the American police and military served two distinct functions. The police protected and served the American public, while the military defeated external threats. Over time, that distinction was blurred. In 1967, for example, ongoing race riots left the LAPD in search of more effective crowd control methods. Former Marine John Nelson provided a solution. During his deployment in Vietnam, Nelson served on a special force recon unit. Nelson had these accurate and aggressive tactical units in mind when he proposed creating SWAT teams to aid the LAPD in crowd control. Whereas the average Marine unit would kill about 7.6 people per man lost, a Force Recon unit would kill about 34. And whereas a regular Marine unit would initiate combat with the enemy only about 20% of the time, a Force Recon unit would initiate combat 95% of the time.
This demonstrates the role of human capital. Intervening abroad provides a learning environment in which participants obtain a unique set of skills to coercively control other people. The skills developed abroad return home, as experiences and training from foreign intervention are transferred to domestic positions.
Implementing Nelson's idea required somebody with some rank and some chutzpah to champion it. Daryl Gates, a World War II veteran and LAPD inspector, filled this role. He understood and approved of Nelson's proposal and spearheaded the development of the first SWAT team. SWAT teams became more widespread at the end of the Cold War as policymakers focused on initiatives like the war on drugs.
The physical capital of the military, such as tactical gear, assault rifles, and armored vehicles, was donated to domestic police throughout the United States by the federal government. This allowed even small agencies to create SWAT units. This combination of human and physical capital contributes to more aggressive forms of domestic policing.
An example is the no-knock raid, where police officers enter the personal property of citizens without notifying them, without knocking. The number of no-knock raids has risen dramatically over time. Since 9/11, a series of federal programs have made state and local police increasingly reliant on the federal government for training, equipment, and intelligence, as well as subject to the federal government's rules, regulations, and influence.
This process of centralization places more power in the hands of the federal government and weakens the checks created by dispersed political power.
Domestic police, who once focused on protecting citizens, begin to view citizens as potential enemies who must be monitored and controlled, threatening their civil liberties. To learn more about the boomerang effect and its impact on domestic civil liberties, buy our new book, Tyranny Comes Home: The Domestic Fate of U.S. Militarism.
To learn more about Hayek program research and graduate student opportunities, visit hayek.mercatus.org.
Now, there are not many quality studies looking at more police equating to more violence. A bunch like to look at and confirm reductions in violence over year to year or other short time frames. And when you have the power to temporarily put people in a prison cell where suddenly the crimes no longer count and remove them from the police presence, guess what? Reported crimes and violence goes down, while you so increase local instability in the long term. So remember what crime is. It is a measurement of police reporting data, not occurrence. And this is rather obvious and on the surface with Baltimore, Chicago, and the myriad of other violence-plagued cities. The worst cities buck the national crime and violence trends because they are the ones who double, triple, and quadruple down on everything we know does not work. These cities are spending their biggest budget items on things that increase crime and violence, things that work against all of the progress that the rest of the budget is working towards. It's an amazing reality. I know we have been taught otherwise, that careers are invested in this, that it all makes sense the way we have been doing things, but it does not work, and it is not based in reality. Violence is a biological malfunction. It is not a matter of individual accountability. This has been produced by Teddy Barachola Productions for iMemberMedia.com. Justice is exemplary of one of the social constructs that plagues the definition attempts from scholars in the streets. The prevailing sense of justice has come to be revenge plus equality. The burn for vengeance is laced in tradition and is rational from the individual. For the group principles of the social bond and the need to continually improve its sustainability, justice can only be the investigation into causation and pursuits to eliminate the conditions of development. Justice is reflected in successfully preventing the recurrence, not of the offender, but the offense. Humans are biological vessels, alleged to possess freedom and execute their own autonomous will. People seem free to choose how they will live and what they will do. But are they? Who is free and whose will is being carried out are necessary questions when exploring why we do the things version of this perception was that, in his words, men are more strongly invited to crimes by sanctuaries than they are deterred by punishment. Unfortunately for Beccaria, he was incorrect in both ways. Violations are committed because of the biological issue of violence or because of conditions such as environmental poisoning, socioeconomic inequality, miseducation, lack of community support, and marginalization. As for deterrence, punishment are not effective at prevention. Deterrents to crime are proper medical care for acts of violence and a variety of non-punitive factors such as proximity to being discovered, access to education, socioeconomic opportunity, adequate nutrition, and legislation preventing great disparity among the classes.